Hi, it's Grandma here, and I'm reading The Sign of the Beaver by Elizabeth George Speare. In the last chapter, we found out that Attean was going to go off into the wilderness by himself until he finds his Manitou, which is his spirit animal. It's part of a ritual among the Native Americans that he must participate in before becoming an adult and being allowed to go on the hunts with the men. Chapter 21. Then one morning, Attean returned. Matt had been waiting and watching the forest trail impatiently, unwilling to go far from the cabin lest he miss the boys coming. But when finally he saw Attean approaching, his heart sank. Attean was not alone. His grandfather stalked by his side. Matt sensed that this meant trouble. Perhaps Sockness had come to reproach him. He would surely know that the two boys had been neglecting those lessons. Dreading to face the old man, Matt walked out to meet him, courteously giving the greeting he had learned. Sockness returned his greeting with dignity. He did not smile. His solemn face made Matt's heart sink still lower. Then, startled, Matt turned toward Attean. He dared not ask a question, but he saw at once that there was no need to ask. No doubt about it, Attean had found his Manitou. He had changed. He stood straighter and taller. He looked older, and Matt suddenly realized why. The black hair, which had always hung straight down to almost his shoulders, was shaved away. His scalp, like his grandfather's, was bare, except for a single patch running back from his forehead and braided into a topknot that fastened with red string. Like the fresh bear grease that glistened on his skin, pride glistened all over him. Moreover, he carried a gleaming new rifle. "You've got a gun!" Matt cried, politeness forgotten. "My grandfather traded many beaver skin," Attean answered. Though he had in these last days become a man, he'd not learned altogether to hide his feelings. He did not say more. He waited now for his grandfather to speak. The old man's face was grave, but he did not ask about the lessons. "Time of sun gets shorter," he said, "like footsteps of bird, soon ice on water." "I know it's October," Matt said, "maybe November." He'd not wanted to count the sticks these last weeks. "Indians go north now," Sockness continued, "hunt moose. All Indians go. Attean not come more to learn white man's signs." Matt could not answer. "White father not come," Sockness went on. Matt spoke quickly. "He ought to be here any day now." Sockness looked at him soberly. "Maybe him not come," he said quietly. Anger flared up in Matt. He could not allow this man to speak the fear he had never dared to admit to himself. "Of course he'll come," he said too loudly. "He might even come today." "Snow comes soon," Sockness persisted. "Not good white boy stay here alone. White boy come with Indians." Matt stared at him. Did he mean go on the hunt with them? The most important hunt of the year? Sockness smiled for the first time. Sockness teach white boy hunt moose like Attean. White boy and Attean be like brother. A sudden, joyful hope sprang into Matt's mind. He realized at this moment just how anxious he had been. This was a way out. He did not have to stay here alone through the long winter. Then, as swiftly as it had come, this new hope died away. In spite of his longing, in spite of being afraid, he knew what he had to answer. "Thank you," he said. "I'd like to go on the hunt, but I can't do that. When my father comes, he wouldn't know where I had gone." "Leave white man's writing." Matt swallowed hard. "Something might happen to the cabin. He's trusting me to take care of it." "Maybe him not come," Sockness said again, not smiling now. "He'll be here soon," Matt insisted. He was ashamed that his voice broke in the middle of the word. If he couldn't come, He'd send someone to tell me. He'd find some way, no matter what. You don't know my pa." Saknus was silent for some time. "White boy, good son," he said at last, "but better you come. Saknus glad for white boy be kniquis." Matt could only keep shaking his head. The man's words had brought a great lump in his throat. "Thank you," he managed. "You've been very good to me, but I have to stay here." Without another word, Saknus held out his hand. Matt put his own hand into that bony grasp. The two Indians turned and went away. Attean had not even said goodbye. There would be no lesson that morning, no story, no tramping in the forest or fishing, not this morning or any other morning. Close to panic, Matt wanted to run after them. He wanted to tell them he had changed his mind, that he would go with them anywhere rather than stay here alone with the winter coming on. But he set his jaw tight and stood where he was. After a few minutes, he reached for his axe and fell to splitting logs with a fury. He couldn't keep from thinking, however, was he just being foolish and stubborn? Wasn't going with them the wisest thing he could have done? Wouldn't his father have understood? He remembered hearing that many white men, and white women too, who had been captured by the Indians and had lived many years in the wilderness, did not want to return to the white world when they had a chance, but had chosen instead to live with the Indians. He had never understood that, but now he could see very well how it might happen. He no longer distrusted them. He knew that Attean and his grandfather would be kind, that even the grandmother would make him feel welcome, and that they would share with him whatever they had, no matter how little. He had found friendship and goodwill in their cabin. He had envied Attean his free, unhampered life in the forest and the boisterous comradeship in the village. If he'd been taken captive as a child and raised as an Indian boy, how would he himself have chosen? It wouldn't be the same to make that choice deliberately. He was proud that they had wanted him to live with them, but he knew that he could never be really proud as Attean was proud of being a hunter. He belonged to his own people. He was bound to his own family, as Attean was bound to his grandfather. The thought that he may never see his mother again was sharper than hunger or loneliness. This was the land his father had cleared to make a home for them all. It was his own land, too. He could not run away. He was troubled that Attean had walked away without a word of farewell. Had he been offended? Had he really wanted Matt to go with them, to be his brother? Or was he only obeying his grandfather as he had to do about the lessons? It was so hard to tell what Attean was thinking. Attean had become a hunter. He had a gun. He would not have time now to wander through the forest or to listen to stories. He would not have to bother any longer with a white boy who would never really be a mighty hunter. But surely Attean could have held out his hand as his grandfather had done. Chapter 22. Every morning, in spite of himself, Matt kept an eye out for Attean. When 4 days had gone by, he decided there was little chance that he would see his friend again. Doubtless the Indians had already left the village and were on their way north. So when he saw Attean coming through the woods with his dog at his heels, he ran across the clearing to meet him, not bothering to hide his relief and pleasure. "You think different?" Attean said quickly. "You go with us?" Matt's eagerness died away. "No," he said unhappily. "Please try to understand, Attean. I must wait for my father." Attean nodded. "I understand," he said. "My grandfather understand too. I do same for my father, if he's still alive." The two boys stood looking at each other. There was no amusement and no scorn in Attean's eyes. How very strange, Matt thought. After all the brave deeds he dreamed of to win this boy's respect, he gained it at last just by doing nothing. just by staying here and refusing to leave. My grandfather sends you gift, Attean said now. He unwrapped from his back a pair of snowshoes. They were new, the wood smoothed and polished, the netting of deer hide woven in a neat design. Before Matt could find words, Attean went on. My grandmother sent gift, he said. He took from his pouch a small birch basket of maple sugar. Late in the season like this, Matt knew sugar was scarce and dear to the Indians. Thank you, he said. Tell your grandmother that when you come back, I'll help gather more sap for her. Attean was silent. Not come back, he said then. In the spring, I mean, when the hunt is over. Not come back, Attean repeated. Not live in village again. Our people find new hunting ground. But this is your home. My people hunters. My grandfather say many white men come soon. Cut down trees, make house, plant corn. Where my people hunt. What could Matt answer to this? He had only one argument to offer. Your grandfather wants you to learn to read, he reminded Attean. I haven't been much of a teacher, but when my family comes, it will be different. My mother will teach you to read and to write too. What for I read? My grandfather, mighty hunter, my father, mighty hunter, they not read. Your grandfather wants you to be able to understand treaties, Matt insisted. We go far away. No more white man. No need to sign paper. An uncomfortable doubt had long been troubling Matt. Now, before Attean went away, he had to know. This land, he said slowly, this place where my father built his cabin, did it belong to your grandfather? Did he own it once? How one man own ground? Attean questioned. Well, my father owns it now. He bought it. I not understand, Attean scowled. How can man own land? Land, same as air. Land for all people to live on, for beaver and deer. Does deer own land? How could you explain, Matt wondered, to someone who did not want to understand? Somewhere in the back of his mind, there was a sudden suspicion that Attean was making sense, and he was not. It was better not to talk about it. Instead, he asked, where will you go? My grandfather say much forest where sun go down. White man not come so far. To the west. Matt had heard his father talk about the west. There was good land there for the taking. Some of their neighbors in Quincy had chosen to go west instead of buying land in Maine. How could he tell Attean that there would be white men there too? Still, they said there was no end of land in the west. He reckoned there must be enough for both white men and Indians. But before he could think what to say, Attean spoke again. I give you gift, he said. Dog like you. I tell him, stay with you. You mean you're not taking him with you? No good for hunt, Attean said. Walk slow now. Good for stay here with Medabi, my white brother. Attean's careless words did not deceive Matt. He knew very well how Attean felt about that no-good dog that followed him everywhere he went. And Attean had said white brother. Matt could not find the words he needed, but he knew there was something he must do. He had to give a gift for Attean, but he had nothing to give, nothing at all that belonged to him. Robinson Crusoe? What could that mean to a boy who never now would learn to read? He had one thing. At the thought of it, something twisted right in his stomach, but it was the only thing he had that could possibly match the gifts Attean had given him. Wait here, he told Attean. He went into the cabin, took down the tin box. The watch was ticking away inside. He had not forgotten to wind it, even when he was too tired to notch a stick. Now he lifted it out, and held it in his hand the way he had held it when his father had given it to him, as though it were a fragile bird's egg. His father would never understand, but he could think about it another minute. Matt hurried back when Attean stood waiting. "I have a gift for you," he said. "It tells the time of day. I'll show you how to wind it up." Attean held the watch even more carefully. There was no mistaking. He was pleased and impressed. Probably, Matt thought, Attean would never learn to use it. The sun and the shadows of the trees told him all he needed to know about the time of day. But Attean knew the gift was important. "Fine gift," he said. He put the watch very gently into his pouch. Then he held out his hand. Awkwardly, the two boys shook hands. "Your father comes soon," Attean said. "I hope you get the biggest moose in Maine," Matt answered. Attean turned and walked into the woods. The dog sprang up to follow him. Attean motioned him back and uttered one stern order. Puzzled, the dog sank down, put his chin between his paws. As Attean walked away, he whined softly, but he obeyed. Matt knelt down and put his hand on the dog's head. Chapter 23. Matt filled his days with work. He made the cabin trim. Where the clay had dried and crumbled away between the logs, he brought new mud, strengthening it with pebbles, and packed the spaces tightly. On the inside, he chinked every tiny crack to make the room snug. The pile of logs stacked against the cabin wall grew steadily higher. His meager harvest was safely stored away. The corn, the little he'd managed to save from the deer and crows, had all been shucked. Sitting by the fire after his supper, he scraped the dried kernels from the cobs, remembering that many long evenings at home when he and his sister Sarah had been set to the same work with a corn scraper. Sarah would laugh now to see him rubbing away with an old clamshell like an Indian. Some of the ears of corn he'd hung against the wall by the twisted husks, as he'd seen his mother do. She'd said once they were like scraps of sunshine on the dark days. Overhead, he hung strips of pumpkin on ropes of vine strung from wall to wall. They would be ready for his mother to make into pie. In a corner leaned the old flour sack, overflowing with nuts he'd gathered, hickory and butternut, and even the acorns he'd once thought proper food only for squirrels. On the shelf ranged birch baskets filled with dried berries, wild cranberries he'd discovered shining like jewels along the boggy shores of the pond. They were puckery to the taste, but when his mother came, she would bring sugar, and the stewed cranberries would make a fine treat with her bread of white flour. Matt forced himself to eat sparingly of these things. The corn he regarded as a sort of trust. His father had planted it and would be counting on it to feed the family through the winter. And some must be saved for the spring planting. Proud though he was of his harvest, Matt knew in his heart that it was far from enough. The hunt for food would be never-ending. Hour after hour with his bow, Matt trampled through the forest, the dog beside him. There was not much game to hunt these days. More often than not, his snares were empty. Soon the animals would be buried deep in burrows. Twice he had glimpsed a caribou moving through the trees, but he had little hope of bringing down any large animal with his light arrows. Once in a long while, he succeeded in shooting a duck or a muskrat. The squirrels were too quick for him. Although the dog was certainly not much of a hunter, he did occasionally track down some small creature. But he also had to eat his share, sometimes more than his share, because Matt could not resist those beseeching eyes. Truth to tell, they were both hungry much of the time. Luckily, they would not starve with the pond and creeks teeming with fish. Matt knew that for many months of the year, fish filled the Indian cookpots. Luckily, too, fish were easy to catch, though Matt had to be continually twisting and splicing new lines from vines and spruce roots. Mornings now, he had to shatter a skim of ice on the pond. Soon, he would have to cut holes with his axe and let his lines down deep. He shivered to think of it. It was the cold that bothered him most. His homespun jacket was still sound since he had little use for it in the warm weather, but his breeches were threadbare. One knee showed naked through a gaping hole, and the frayed legs stopped a good 5 inches above his ankles. His linen shirt was thin as a page of his father's Bible, and so small for him that it threatened to split every time he moved. Even inside the cabin, he was scarcely warm enough. The moment he ventured outside, his teeth chattered. He thought enviously of the Indian's deerskin leggings, but a deer was far beyond his prowess as a hunter. There were 2 blankets in his pine bed, his father's and his own. Why couldn't one of them cover him in the daytime as well as night? He spread a blanket out on the floor, hacked it with his axe and his knife, using his worn-out breeches as a pattern. From the leftover scraps, he carefully pulled threads and twisted them together. He'd seen the Indian women using bone needles. He searched about outside the cabin till he found some thin, hard bits of bone. These he shaved down with his knife. He ruined 3 bits trying to poke a hole through the bone before he thought to try a thin slit instead to hold the thread. Finally, he managed to sew his woolen pieces together. He thrust his legs into the shapeless breeches and gathered the top about his waist with a bit of rope. He was mighty pleased with himself. He was going to be forever hauling them up, and they were sure to rip if he had to run, but at least he could kneel on the ice and pull in his lines. From 2 rabbit skins, he made some mittens without thumbs. He had no stockings, and his moose-hide moccasins were wearing thin. He decided he could stuff them with scraps of blanket or even with duck feathers. He remembered that once in a downpour, Attean had shown him how to line his moccasins with dried moss to soak up the rain. Perhaps moss could soak up the cold as well, and there was plenty of it about. His most satisfying achievement was his fur hat. For this he knew he must have more fur. In the woods, Attean had once pointed out to him a deadfall constructed of heavy logs so intricately balanced that they would fall with dead accuracy on an animal that attempted to steal the bait inside. Beaver and otter were caught in such traps, Attean explained, sometimes even bear. Now Matt determined to make one for himself, perhaps a small one. It would take a very large log even to stun a strong animal, and he had no wish to come upon a wounded bear. Much as he would like a bearskin, he would try for a smaller animal. He felled and trimmed 2 good-sized trees. Setting the logs on lighter posts was a feat of delicate balance that took him hours of patient trial and error. Over and over they crashed down, threatening his toes and fingers, and finally they held to his satisfaction, and gingerly he slipped 3 fish inside the trap. To his astonishment, on the 3rd morning, he found an animal lying under the fallen logs, so nearly dead that it was no task to club it. It was smaller than the otters he'd seen playing along the banks. A fisher, perhaps. That night, he and the dog feasted on crackling bits of roast meat. It was strong flavored, and he knew the Indians did not care to eat it, but he could not be so choosy. Other strips he hung over the fire to smoke. There was also a scant amount of yellow fat. Used sparingly, a spoonful of that fat would make the usual fish diet taste like a banquet. The real treasure was the pelt, heavy and lustrous. He worked on it slowly as he'd watched the Indian women work. With a sharp-edged stone, he scraped away every trace of fat and flesh from the skin, washed it in the creek, and for days in his spare hours rubbed and stretched it to make it soft and pliable. Then he set to work with his bone needle. He was enormously proud of the cap he fashioned. Saknus himself would have envied it. Most of this work he had done by firelight. He longed for candles. He ate a supper by the light of split pine branches set in a crack in the chimney. They gave light aplenty, but they smoked and dripped sticky pitch, and he was always afraid he might drop off to sleep and wake up to find log chimney afire. But at any rate, after a day of chopping and tramping, he was tired enough to go to bed with the dark. So often as he did the squaw work that Attean would have despised, thoughts of his mother filled his head. He imagined her moving about the cabin, humming her little tunes as she beat up the batch of cornbread, shaking out the board cloth at the door, for of course she would not let them eat at a bare table. He could see her sitting by the firelight in the evening, her knitting needles clicking as she made a woolen sock for him. Sometimes he could almost hear the sound of her voice, and when he shut his eyes, he could see her special smile. He tried to think of ways to please her. She would need new dishes for the good meals she would cook. He whittled out 4 wooden trenchers and 4 clean new bowls, rubbing them smooth with sand from the creek. He made a little brush to clean them with from a birch sapling, carefully splitting the ends into thin fibers. In the same way, he made a sturdy birch broom to sweep the floor. Then he set himself a more difficult task, a cradle for the baby. With only an axe in his task, his knife, the work took all his patience. His first attempts were fit only for kindling, but when the cradle was done, he was proud of it. It was clumsy, perhaps, but it rocked without bumping, and there wasn't a splinter anywhere to harm baby's skin. Sitting by the fire, it seemed to promise that soon his family would be there. When he had a few more rabbit skins, he would make a soft coverlet. For Sarah, he made a corn husk doll with corn silk hair. He was surprised at how much he looked forward to Sarah's coming. Back at home, she'd been nothing but a pesky child, always following him about and pestering him to be taken along where he was going. Now he remembered the way she'd run to meet him when he came home from school, pigtails flying, eyes shining, demanding to know everything that had happened there. Sarah hated fiercely being a girl and having no school to go to. She would be full of curiosity in the forest. She wasn't afraid like most girls. She was spunky enough to try almost anything. She was like that Indian girl, Attean's sister. What a pity they couldn't have known each other. Well, at least it sounds like he is making progress. I kind of wonder how he would have managed all that if he'd never met Attean, who taught him so many survival tricks. But he's doing very well, and I hope his family comes soon. Don't you? Bye-bye.